This meeting is being live streamed. Got it.
Yeah. Okay. So Tanzania Kinipu Wapaskemikisimiquanapio, many blessings to all my relations in the four directions. John Gonzalez here with Standing Bear Network from Wikwemikong people, and it's an honor to share space with so many wonderful, knowledgeable, and educated people, that are helping to empower our grassroots communities, by giving them the educational tools that they need to, come up with, to figure out what their self-determination plan looks like. I'm here right now, with an incredible guest, Rolland Pangowish. And, I think I originally got it wrong when I first put out the flyer for this interview, right? But, you're a former director of land rights at AFN from 1988 to 2004. And also lands claims negotiator for the community. Wikwemikong. Wikwemikong, thank you.
Yeah.
Wikwemikong, Unceded Indian Reserve from 2005 to 2013. And it's not surprising that you and Russ Daibo go back a long way.
Yeah.
And first, I just want to say thank you for your presence. And, you're in our prayers because we know that you've been experiencing some health issues, and, we need to heal. I mean, it's so important on so many levels. And I want to thank you, for all that you have done. So what can you tell us about your experience? I don't even know where to begin. Do we begin with lands claims? Do we,
Well, I guess this journey started for me back in when I first went to school in 1977. That's when I met Russ Daibo that year, actually. And many of my lifelong friends, I never thought in school that I would end up, making lifelong friends, but that's what happens. That's why I encourage young people to go to school, because you never know who you're going to meet, and it's a worthwhile experience. But back then, before I went to school, the Wounded Knee happened in the United States, and then we had just a couple of years before that, we had the Anishinaabe Park in Kenora, Ontario, where warriors stood up for traditional people against the government, basically. And since that time, a lot has happened. And a lot has happened, really. I guess I usually start talking about these issues with 1969 and the White Paper, when Canada wanted to eliminate the Indian Act under Justin Trudeau's father, Pierre Trudeau. And people immediately reacted from the grassroots level, protesting against this arbitrary action by the government of Canada. The White Paper was a policy paper where they were proposing changes, eliminating the Indian Act. And people reacted, people were concerned about losing tax exemption, but the two biggest issues that stopped that, which remain to this day, were the outstanding land issues, land claims, and the other thing was the treaty issues, the treaty relationship, and what we do about the treaties. And those two issues, Canada realized, I guess they didn't adequately consider those, because then they realized they can't go forward with that policy without addressing these issues adequately. And soon after that, the Calder case on Aboriginal title went through the Supreme Court. And what that did was, although it wasn't finally decided, the issue did establish by the Supreme Court of Canada that there is Aboriginal rights, that they do exist, and they pre-exist Canadian law. And since that time, Well, really, that's when the funding began to flow to First Nations. For one thing, land claims research began. They began funding that because there were so many outstanding land claims. And when I started, after school, after university, I came to Ottawa, and I was trying to get a job at AFN. And that's in 1983, I believe it was, yeah. And a friend of mine suggested, well, why don't you look at, or not my friend, the personnel director at the AFN suggested I look at working at Indian Affairs for a while. He said, look at it as a school, which really changed my mind because I had never even considered working at, for the government. But I did go in, I did get a job as a clerk, and I was eligible for other positions. So I ended up getting the job at claims funding, which was a very good experience because I learned federal land claims policy inside out, and had a good understanding of it, because in administering the funding for land claims research and the loan funding for negotiations, I learned about the claims right across Canada, from coast to coast and up north. And so in 1988, when I applied for the job of land rights policy analyst at AFN, I aced the job, got in, and the Oka crisis happened in 1990. And so finally, land claims was on the agenda again, because it hadn't been. And by that time, I understood the process that they established in 1973 was very problematic. For one thing, there was a conflict of interest because the government is administering the resolution of claims against itself, and that created a tough situation with land claims negotiations. Generally stretch on, even back then in the 1980s, these land claims were going 10 years and more in some cases. So at that point, there was a backlog of some 600 accepted specific claims. There was and then again, we have to look at the two streams of claims process. One was specific claims, which relates to the government's administration of Indian lands or other assets, as well as what they call specific treaty provisions. So essentially, that definition of specific claims has not changed in all these years. However, it still is not adequately, a process to resolve claims has not been adequately established, because it's still under the control of the department. The other type was the claims relating to what they call Aboriginal title, unsurrendered Indian lands, as they used to define it. And in that process, negotiations are even longer. Of course, it's a more comprehensive negotiation of issues. And but what developed was what we call, it was basically aimed at extinguishment, which was to obtain a surrender of the bulk of a community or people's, a nation, their lands, which they had never surrendered to the Crown. But the objective of the process was to achieve essentially the same thing, and that has not changed to this day. It used to be a surrender clause was included that was almost the precise language from the numbered treaties. That clause was in the modern land claims agreements, like the James Bay Northern Quebec Agreement. Well, not very many were settled. By the time they got to the Nisga'a in BC, the next big claim to be addressed, although there was other settlements, they they realized that they were contradicting the Constitution, which recognizes and affirms existing Aboriginal and treaty rights. And so what they did was they put in this clause they call the set-aside provision, which instead of a surrender, what they're saying is you will have no other rights but what's in this agreement, what's set out in the agreement. And that's called the set-aside provision instead of the surrender clause. And the second part of that is what they call the fallback provision, which is that if in future, it says in the general provisions of those agreements, the modern comprehensive claim or land claim agreements, they try to call treaties. But anyways, the fallback was that if in future the courts define inherent or First Nation rights, that under the agreement, you will still be bound by its provisions defining what your rights are, that you won't have access to those legal clarifications in the future. Whether that's legally effective has never been tested and is in question, like much of First Nation issues. What I found through the years is that we're looking at, like back home, when I moved home in 2005, to take up negotiating and dealing with our land claims at home. I'm from Manitoulin Island, which is a big island on the north side end of Lake Huron there. And it's populated by Anishinaabe peoples, Ojibwe, Odawa, and Potawatomi. 5 reserves on the island. Where I come from is called the Wikwemikong Unceded Indian Reserve, because we refused to sign a treaty that they proposed, that the province, actually Upper Canada, proposed in 1862. And at that time, we have a court case filed on that particular surrender because it wasn't properly done. But from that time, they drew a line through the island. We're on the Eastern Peninsula, and they called it the unceded portion. So we've called ourselves the Unseated Indian Reserve since, because the only treaty, we signed an agreement in 1836. It's with Sir Francis Bond Head, who was the newly appointed Governor General at the time. And we understood the agreement that he was affirming our title, our ownership of the Manitoulin Island and the thousands of surrounding islands, because our people fished always amongst those islands in Lake Huron. So we've witnessed, we had that, and then our treaty is the 1764 Treaty of Niagara, which was done after Pontiac's war, who was from our nation, the Odawa. But he did lead a confederacy against the British assuming occupation of the former French colonies, according to colonial laws, which we've never acknowledged. I mean, we had relations. By this treaty, we made peace with the British because we had been at war with them. Right. And there was 2 wampum belts that are fairly well known. One is the Covenant Chain Treaty, which has a illustration of one person holding one end, and there's a chain, and at the other end there's a boat. Well, there's a rock, sorry, which represents North America or the port at Quebec City. And the boat represented the British and bringing us presents, because whenever we met in council, starting at that time in 1764, with William Johnson was the first Indian Affairs official for the British Crown. He put together those belts and proposed that relationship. And I think all First Nations should know about this, because this is sort of like the mother of all treaties. It was the original establishment of relations with what they called the 24 nations, because on the other belt, is 24 figures across, all grasping hands, and that's called the 24 Nations Belt. And that was the alliance with the British, that in future we would be friends. And starting at that point, they would distribute supplies to us as an acknowledgement of our relations. That began in 1764 and continued for over 100 years. They kind of phased it out in the 1860s. But those belts are very important because they established the relationship, which is a nation-to-nation relationship. And any subsequent agreements were in compliance. Oh yeah, there's a two-row wampum belt. That's the Iroquois. We all used wampum belts in the Great Lakes back those days, which whenever agreements were done, whenever you called someone to a meeting, you would send a string of wampum. It was our way of communicating and recording agreements, right, along with our ceremonies. So in any case, I just wanted to establish some background to our people at Wikwemikong and why we're called the Unseated Indian Reserve. And what we're dealing with is this government administration, which is really a colonial situation that we've been in for all these years. People are using the term all the time, but we need to understand the details of what it means, because it's relevant today with what's going on with federal policy. Right. You should note that these issues remained outstanding. I mean, we did achieve this inclusion of Section 25 and 35 in Canada's Constitution when they repatriated it in 1982. 35 recognizes and affirms existing Aboriginal and Treaty rights. And Section 25 was an exemption from the application of the Charter, the Bill of Rights Charter and the Canadian Charter of Rights in the Constitution, which is about individual rights. But with respect to, because treaty rights and inherent rights are collective in nature, they belong to our people, our nations as a whole. They're not like individual rights, they're kind of unique, I guess, in international law, because the only international law, since World War II, they established in the UN the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, which is primarily about individual rights, but there are collective rights with respect to labor rights, which are well fleshed out over the years, if not controversial yet. But in terms of collective rights, the international legal system is just now coming to grips with the rights of, others other than nation states, because in the international system, they use these so-called nation states as the primary unit of recognition. And Indigenous peoples we're kind of outside of that, although we're within these nations. And this is the case around the world. I was fortunate enough to work on behalf of the Assembly of First Nations at the UN human rights activities in Geneva, working groups that developed the draft declaration on the rights of Indigenous peoples. I participated in several sessions of that over the years, and also the establishment of what they called the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. I remember the Indigenous delegates from around the world. That was a good experience because we worked together to lobby the governments, because the UN consists of these nation states. They are the constituency, the voters, but they do have what they call civil society, or NGOs, non-governmental organizations, that get involved in the various development of policy and processes in the UN. So Indigenous peoples have had a great impact, I think, on the UN system because of our participation in these processes. And the most interesting thing, I think, because we worked with Indigenous people from South America, from New Zealand, Australia, even Northern Europe, where the Sami, or what used to be called Laplanders, were treated the same way as us. I remember I talked to an in-law who was in the forestry industry many years ago, and he remembers visiting Norway and seeing these, what they called Laplanders back then. They were treated almost like our people, wherein they were not allowed to purchase alcohol. They were controlled and being assimilated. And they were northern peoples that migrated with reindeer. But I think all these different peoples have contributed a great deal to what today is the international legal concepts in terms of Indigenous rights. And of course, because it was being developed by states, we have provisions that in the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, the UN Declaration, that address the concerns of nation states as well as Indigenous peoples. So while we have many of our fundamental rights recognized in the Declaration, there are also state provisions such as the territory, nothing will affect the territorial integrity of states is one of the, so what the biggest concern of many states, of course, was, the idea of separation or, losing parts of their country to Indigenous people separating. But in Canada, I think, although we do have some nations who advocate, that position, for the bulk of us, I think I guess in looking at the AFN, when the Constitution was patriated in 1982, the slogan at AFN was completing the circle of confederation. What they were saying is, in Canada, we have the provinces and the federal government, and all we're missing is the Indigenous governments. And that we should be what they used to call a third order of government within the country, because you have the provincial crown, the federal crown. Well, to this day, Trudeau is telling us that we cannot change that. This is the problem. This goes to the heart of the issue, I think, because what they're saying is you only have the authority of these two parts of the crown. And the crown, their laws are complex for our people to understand many times, because they talk about the indivisibility of the crown. The crown is one thing, but in Canada, it's divided into two jurisdictions. And that's where 9124 came into play under the British North America Act of 1867, which is now Constitution Act 1867. It's 9124 says the federal government will be responsible for Indians and lands reserved for Indians. And that's been the case till this day. The provincial governments, where the contradiction comes is the provincial governments were allocated jurisdiction over lands and resources within the provinces, where that creates a problem for us when we have outstanding issues or interests in land and rights on crown land. Our rights were basically ignored until we brought it up periodically, but now, it's been a concerted effort since the white paper days in '69. We tried to organize before that nationally, but the efforts were sporadic and difficult because of the control under the Indian Act, the way it used to be applied, especially in the West, where there was pass laws and any organizing by Indians was always considered a threat, I guess, if it was independent of the government's management. I hope I'm not jumping around too much. I'm just trying to give a background because
This is good.
we need to understand these things to move forward. Because in 1982, then, when we got that Section 35 and 25 in, the dilemma was that governance wasn't explicitly addressed in it, although governments acknowledge that there is this governance issue that's important. But what we've talked about for years is the right to self-determination, and that's part of the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, which says a people may freely choose their political affiliation and may not be deprived of their means of subsistence. These are some of the primary definition of what it means, self-determination. Well, obviously our means of subsistence has been greatly impacted. And this is what's interesting about common law, what I've learned about it. We've had to deal with it in trying to deal with these issues. And common law is an interesting process because based on precedent and legal principles, there is the application within it of principles of like natural justice. And that's where, although there was a colonial system, and that's been discredited more and more, especially when it comes to Aboriginal title, beginning with the Mabel case in Australia. A group of Torres Strait Islanders filed a claim against the Crown there, and they won, and the court explicitly invalidated colonial concepts of discovery and terra nullius, which they were using to claim our lands. And this is important in today, because today we have a situation where there's so much in between. I'm sorry, but I'll just get to where we are today, because I mean, we've had the debate since 1982. What is the content of Section 35? And you've probably heard of the full box, empty box characterization, which is that we know what our rights are, and they're all supposed to be protected by that Section 35 of Canada's Constitution. However, Canada says that no, those rights are not defined, that they must be basically negotiated, is what they're saying, and failing that, because since 1982, I mean, that's 40 years ago, we haven't reached agreement on what self-government really means. Short of sovereignty, it does mean that by inherent rights, we have a right to govern ourselves that in our tradition was accorded us by the Creator, but it pre-exists. And then common law recognizes this, that our rights pre-exist the establishment of the Crown over these lands here in Canada. That's an important concept, because in common law, what it says is being here first has meaning and has implications. These people arrived afterwards. And the problem I think we have now, because we couldn't define Section 35, so now the government has been planning this for some time. It's, the policies that are being implemented today by the Trudeau government. And the problem now is that they use all kinds of rhetoric and they've done this all along. They've taken our concepts in our language, like First Nations, for instance, and adopt it and change it. They utilize their legal and policy powers to alter the meaning of what we meant by First Nations. I mean, by that we meant we were here before they ever came. And we have a problem with this assertion of Crown title. And it's something our people, our nations, especially those that are very conscious of never surrendering our sovereignty to the Crown, how did they acquire this jurisdiction over our lands when we never, in many places, we never gave it to them? And where there are treaties, of course, there was the understanding that there was an agreement to share land, but people were not giving up their inherent rights to those lands, to their traditional territories. But the way the government interprets it, for instance, the numbered treaties were about land surrenders. So there's a real dichotomy in how they understand the treaties and how we do. I think up until Minister Irwin's time under the Chrétien government, it's been a constant process of trying to educate federal officials because they looked at treaties as, Ron Irwin especially, I remember, he looked at it as like a checklist. They do these things and it's done. The treaty's over, boom, like a real estate transaction. And that's not the case. For our people, the treaties were sacred agreements that established a relationship. And this has been the difficulty, is maintaining that relationship with the Crown, because it's an ongoing thing. So that required some severe educating, which continues. And to this day, I think there is no federal treaty policy. They have no policy with respect to how they deal with treaties. Despite all their rhetoric and their financing of various what they call treaty commissioners. The treaty commissioners in Manitoba, Saskatchewan, I don't know if they have one in Alberta, but they're basically education efforts. They're not about treaty relations. I suppose, I mean, it's good that we get some financing and can do further research and develop our rationale and arguments, but the thing is, and teach our younger people, which is very important, but we're not addressing the treaty relationship. It's never been addressed, and it's not about to be addressed. Despite any rhetoric they use today, they have no intention of, even though they say everything's based on treaty. Well, where is that then if we're supposed to deal with these things on a bilateral basis? And a lot of people, don't understand this Indian Act. And I think one of the things, as a land rights person, and I had the treaty portfolio at the AFN at different times. When we didn't have a treaty unit, they would send it over to land rights. And so off and on, I've dealt with these issues over the years. But one of the key things is that, I'm sorry, my mind is just going, there's so many issues related to every issue. That's why it's so difficult to explain our issues to non-First Nation people, is because everything is complicated and everything is at issue. For instance, taxation. There's no way to say that there's a taxation expert in dealing with First Nation tax issues, because it's all up in the air. There's a federal policy at Revenue Canada, the connecting factors and all those things Canada has imposed, but there's no clarity. So it's constantly in question. This is what they said about Aboriginal title. They said, we can't continue with this situation of uncertainty. So we must bring certainty to the situation, but the way they were bringing certainty is to extinguish our rights. I left that hanging, yes. Instead of the surrender clause, oh yeah, I did mention it, they replaced it with this new technique. But this is all federal policy driven. Although they say they work with us, this is another thing that I find very frustrating. when there's controversial issues, confrontations or disputes, they say, or the courts will say, refer cases back to the parties and say negotiate a solution, or there'll be in resolving a standoff or whatever, there'll be the establishment of negotiations. The problem with negotiations is that the federal government is controlling the negotiations. They set the parameters, they set the framework, and they manage it. So it's really a one-sided process, negotiations, and especially with regard to land claims or self-government or governance, they are dictating the parameters of those negotiations and what can be achieved, to the point where it's really a misnomer to call it negotiations, because what they're doing is predefining the optional solutions. The possible resolutions are predetermined, and basically you're in there talking to them to choose which option you're going to pursue. And they're all prejudicial to our legal rights. So I cannot stand hearing this reference to negotiations, because in specific claims and governance and almost any other issue, they are imposing the parameters of that negotiation and the possible solutions. And that's a problem in itself that we've had for many years. And it doesn't satisfy the people. When you get caught up in those negotiations, you end up with legal experts, and your negotiators and your chiefs and councils end up addressing these federal issues, not the issues as they see the issues. And they end up getting caught up in that vocabulary, that type of approach to the issues, which are dictated by federal policy, which are unilaterally established. I helped coordinate a national process a number of years ago on specific claims. Well, actually two. One from 1990, after OCA, they recognized they'd had to do something about these land claims policies, because up to that time in 1990, they had only settled 24 specific claims, and there was 1,200 outstanding claims and approximately 2,000 more that were in research, which is not hard to understand when you think the federal government has been administering Indian reserves and bands, trust accounts for over 150 years, and that they make mistakes. And a lot of times those mistakes, we lose land, we lose resources, financial resources, etc. So the problem is many of these historical violations, and if we're going to look at rights in terms of fiduciary obligations, which the court seemed to first establish in the Sparrow case back in, the Guerin case back in the early 80s, which said, the federal government has a fiduciary responsibility to the First Nations with respect to land, and that it's the highest standards of conduct must be applied and to their administration of because a fiduciary is like a trust-like relationship, except that one party is acting on behalf of another's interests unilaterally. They're not consulting. You don't directly, like a trustee relationship. It's done by the Crown just doing it. So the highest standards, the court did declare that the highest standards are to be applied, but we've seen nothing but a lowering of standards since that time. Because, since that time, they further defined it into two types of fiduciary. One was related to the specific claims, which are the government's administration of our interests, our lands and trust accounts. The other is with respect to Aboriginal rights or Indigenous rights, inherent rights, which which is a broader fiduciary in that the Crown is not to act in a way that impinges upon those rights or violates them. So these are two onerous standards that are supposed to be applied, but I question whether this fiduciary concept is even being utilized or followed, because I've been reading since I got sick. I've had time to read what I feel like reading, and I've been reading all the fiduciary papers I can find. And the primary duty of a fiduciary is to the beneficiary. And I would argue that they're not following the best, they have not pursued the best interests of our people, especially when it comes to these issues of governance. But I guess one of the cases trying to deal with this was the Sampson Cree Nation in Alberta went to court over the oil revenues, that it could get control of its trust accounts, where they're still governed by this Indian Oil and Gas Act, and it still exists. It's still applied. Even under the First Nation Land Management Act, you still have, when it comes to subsurface or petroleum resources, this Indian Oil and Gas Act still applies, and it's very colonial in nature. And but anyway, the Sampson Cree didn't win that case in the manner. They couldn't get control of their trust accounts. The courts supported this federal management. So I think we've got some serious underlying issues that remain outstanding. And that's the hardest thing to explain to our people, is that they know land is theirs. It's always been theirs. But to explain to them how it's not recognized is very difficult, because I'm just trying to do an introductory comments here, and it gets into so many issues. I guess
Yeah,
this is all leading up to, I guess, talking about this First Nations Land Management Act. But before I do that, I just wanted to mention where this all led, because the issues were still outstanding with regard to the Indian Act. It all started in '69 when they wanted to just get rid of the Indian Act. They recognized that there was some degree of injustice in it, but there's that flip side also, the obligations, the fiduciary legal obligations that arose from the imposition of that Indian Act. And that's why I say common law is very interesting, because those obligations, legal obligations, are applied based on principles of natural justice, basically. When you take over somebody's land and begin to manage it, there's legal implications and obligations that arise out of that.
right.
So that's important for us to keep in mind, because we hadn't resolved this issue of the Indian Act. Through my experience, I saw it, the government was always asking for models. We want a model that we can approve. And First Nations kept saying, no, we're diverse, and there's no one model that can be applied to all our nations. We all have different histories and so forth.
Right.
But that left the issue hanging for so long, where we knew we had to get rid of this Indian Act, but at the same time, getting rid of it is a process in and of itself that was problematic because of those underlying issues. Always arise, but they found a way to get around it, I guess, they think, because what they've done now, the UN did approve the declaration, which is basically a moral document. It sets out what the standards of conduct for nation states should be in dealing with Indigenous people's rights.
Minimal standards.
Yeah, they're international human rights standards.
Mm-hmm.
they used to call it an aspirational document, because it's not like a it's not like a law where like the International Human Rights Declaration, the Universal Declaration on Human Rights. There were 2 covenants passed, and that was in the Cold War days. The Covenant on Economic and Social Rights, and the Covenant on political on political rights. One was to satisfy the West, one the East. But basically, those further defined the human rights. And there's 2 monitoring bodies that, because states had to sign on to those. Now, those are international treaties and laws, unlike the Declaration, which is an aspirational instrument. Those laws are monitored by the UN. If you've signed on, then you are reviewed every 5 years and are to report and appear before the UN Human Rights Committee, or whatever it's called now. But in any case, though, that is where we began to have some impact on Canada, in terms of, basically, the UN is a tool that can be used to embarrass Canada, to highlight in the international community where they're falling short. And the Committee on Economic and Social Rights, as well as the other committee, pointed out, going back to 1998, 97, 98, in that period, they began citing the ongoing alienation of Indigenous lands and resources as being that it's still going on, and that it's the main source of Indigenous marginalization, social and economic marginalization within Canada. So that is pretty significant, although it received, like little blurbs in the paper, but not much on it. But that's key, because that is relates directly to the right of self-determination. Of course, that right was difficult in the Declaration, but we did get it in, and the states got, the protection of their territorial integrity, as they call it. But the 2 must be balanced. So I think it's important to understand the right of self-determination, because the right to freely choose your political affiliation and not to be deprived of your means of subsistence are 2 substantial issues First Nations in Canada face. And we're not being allowed to choose our political affiliation. I mean, I think the bulk of us are willing to be a part of Canada, but we want to be a fair part, an equal part in Canada. And that's not being recognized under federal policy. And there's many examples. I guess beginning, it's not the Trudeau government that came up with these techniques they're using to undermine our self-determination rights. These things have been in development for over 20 years, because they began. That's when I left the AFN in 2004. It was under a cloud of controversy, I guess, because there was a split within the AFN at the time. I always call it the economic enthusiasts on one hand, quick buck chiefs, and on the other hand, the fundamental rights people. And there's been a split between them. One wants to and both have our people's future in mind. I mean, the economic development enthusiasts want to develop, the economic income of our people and resources. Of course, you need those in today's world, but the rights people, of course, want to have our rights recognized and implemented. So between the 2, there's often contradiction. And it seems that to get more revenue means too often to sacrifice the fundamental, and that split, that controversy characterized the national picture, I think, up until recently, because the Land Management Act is a good example, because when that was introduced in the late 90s, there were several assemblies that dealt with this, and it was soundly rejected by the chiefs as not a good model, because it was it basically although, okay, it was started basically, I'll go through the history. The West Bank First Nation in BC wanted to, well, they were already leasing lands, but they wanted to, leasing land, I guess, was their primary source of income, and could have been, and is quite lucrative for it. So they promoted getting this act where they could get out of the Indian Act and not go through those procedures for leasing land, and could develop their own laws, etc. And several other bands, primarily bands that were located next to urban centers where they thought they could take advantage of the markets to develop their economic activities and revenues. So 13 bands originally pursued this, and I remember the first title was called the Chartered Lands Act, and then from there it developed into this Land Management Act. But the chiefs soundly rejected it, so it was explicitly declared that it applied only to these 13 bands, the original bands, but it could be made available to other bands who might wish to pursue it. But it was certainly not a preferred model of governance for our people. It was rejected on several occasions. The one I remember most explicitly, I suppose, was I think it was 97, the assembly we had in Tsutina in Alberta, where Robert Louis, the chief from West Bank, came, and he was arguing with the elders in the assembly, who the elders were very concerned about this and soundly rejected it. But he made very strong arguments for it, and so anyways, there was no resolution there. It was just soundly rejected by the assembly. But it did eventually, the legislation was done, and following that, the funny development that is so related yet wasn't recognized was the development of what they call these national institutions by legislation beginning around 2000, I forget when it was, 3 maybe. I sent a paper, there's a good paper this geographer lawyer did on covering that legislation beginning in 2003 to set up these national institutions, the First Nation Land Management Board, the First Nation Taxation Advisory Board, and there was 4 institutions set up. One was for statistics and data. And of course, that one was taken up by First Nations quite successfully, so they eliminated it. It seems anything we do that's successful at our own initiative, they won't support. So they changed that. But these institutions were set up and are based out of Vancouver. And it wasn't clear to a lot of people at the time, but the people that understood were adamantly opposed to this, because what they were setting up is these corporate mechanisms that would guide First Nations who take up these alternative, they called it alternative legislation to the Indian Act provisions. And in land, we're talking about 40 sections now since they've amended the Land Management Act. And for instance, the Land Management Board over there deals with that and helps First Nations get onto this. I think what so many years passed that it seems we have a young leadership that doesn't remember how controversial this this approach and this particular act was at the time. And now, well, I saw a few years ago, the Trudeau government devoted $150 million was allocated to promote the First Nation Land Management Act among the First Nations. And now I see First Nations are pursuing it, even Northern First Nations in rural, you know, in isolated communities, which is totally inappropriate. I don't see what advantage they would have, you know, to leaving the Indian Act at, under those conditions, because basically we can say what it's facilitating is the release of federal fiduciary obligations. Number one, to me, that's a major issue that's not being recognized in this, because it's not about, you know, the economic and development enthusiasts will say, oh, well, we got to do things on our own. We can't be asking the government all the time. Is there, as I was saying, in because of the colonial experience, there's obligations on the part of the Crown that cannot be easily abandoned, or should not be so easily abandoned, because they have implications. Our outstanding claims against the Crown, of course, those are not supposed to be eliminated even under these acts, but in future there would be no Crown liability. So you're moving out of that Crown protection. That fiduciary relationship ends with respect to whatever alternative act you're using. And in land management, it's very crucial. I think that's the biggest item besides governance. So you have this, so all the files that are at Indian Affairs, your land management files, et cetera, are transferred over to these bodies out in BC, these corporate entities that were set up and are federally financed. How long they will continue once the federal government, if it achieves shedding all its obligations to First Nations, there's no provision in the legislation that they have to fund these bodies. So I don't know, you know, it's kind of a precarious world. Anyways, they are set up to administer the implementation of those acts, and basically your chief and council become like the fiduciaries, basically in a manner similar to municipalities. Now, municipalities are creatures of provincial jurisdiction, but they are basically municipal corporations that have to raise their own money by taxation and other investments. And so that's basically where the Land Management Act takes you, is to becoming a federal municipality rather than a provincial. A federal municipality under federal jurisdiction. This is the thing. All the governance provisions of these alternatives to the Indian Act are pursuant to federal laws. So you're not escaping federal law. You're under federal jurisdiction. You remain under federal jurisdiction. But the thing is, it's delegated authorities that you operate with under these acts, except there's no longer a federal obligation. So it's to me, it's a complete conflict of interest on the part of the Crown. And to me, the way they're doing it without explaining all these implications properly to First Nations, it's a breach of fiduciary obligations in itself. But nobody sees that, and nobody seems to be challenging this. So it's quite disturbing to me. So I have my unique perspective, I suppose, but I don't hear anybody else talking about these issues. And the constitutional issues, Russ is Daibo is one of the key people that's been articulating these constitutional issues over the years, because I don't think I know anyone who's monitored federal policy as intensely as he has over the last 40 years or more, nearing 50 years, unfortunately. We're getting older, but nonetheless, so he has a good handle on how the policy developments have taken place. And that's very important. We need to have that articulated and taught, because people are not seeing it, especially in the context of constitutional law. Because I used to say, you know, our people have to be experts in constitutional law to deal with the federal government. Otherwise, they'll take you where you don't know you're going. And I think that's the case with this Land Management Act, because people are not understanding the implications. Because the other thing that gets me is we talk about governance based on our culture, our values as First Nations. But the Land Management Act, although it says you can, you know, design your own land management plan, it has to meet, you know, the basic framework of it, which is as a municipal government that is making developing its sole source revenues, your own source revenues. But it makes it almost inevitable that they will impose a taxation. And the Taxation Act, another one of these governance authorities, that they're what it does is you can invoke that act under the First Nation Land Management Act with just 6 weeks notice, I think it is, or 2 months notice to your community members. So you don't need to go back and have a vote. One thing about the Land Management Act, there must be a vote. But anytime you see a vote, a referendum under the Indian Act provisions, you know that something is affecting your rights. That's why they need a vote. You know, for like land claim settlements is what I'm most familiar with. And what they've been doing, though, is lowering the standards for approval. It used to be a majority of your membership must approve these things. And if on the first round, you know, you didn't have enough people voting, but the majority seemed to indicate support, they would hold a second referendum where a simple majority of those voting can approve law. Mm-hmm. And they're loosening that up all the time and making it easier and easier to give away your rights. Because basically that's what it is. It's like a surrender, but there's no surrender word in it or language, but basically that's what it's accomplishing. It's releasing the federal government from its fiduciary obligations, let alone the treaty relationship, which is not even legally acknowledged. There's a lot of rhetoric about it and talk of partnership and all this, but when it comes to the legal relationship, it's not being addressed as an ongoing relationship. But anyway, this municipality business is because you can see, although there's provision, bands could design it themselves within certain parameters, it's all geared to setting up municipal type governments that deal with private lands, because it sets out that the reserve will be surveyed and divided or subdivided into lots, and it envisions, you know, codes and municipal codes that cover those lands. Private lands are valued. It requires that they be valuated. That means given dollar values, etc. And so what it's doing is it's creating a municipality along that model of land management, which is based on private property and you know, money values. But that is something that I mean, some chiefs were pushing this act on private property to make reserves private property, the property, but this is almost accomplishing that without being explicit about it. But to me, that's not consistent with our culture or with First Nation values.
I'm sure if people have seen this, but.
Well, yeah. Fourth level Indigenous municipalities, modern treaties, land codes, self-government. Yes, this is, you've got several routes, actually. There should be several doors.
Oh, yeah.
They all converge on the same place.
Yeah.
Which is a termination of what we considered our nation-to-nation relationship. Because that was the problem with this recent bill C-15 on the declaration. While Canada frames it as if, and I don't understand legal, I'll talk about legal counsel after this, but what they're doing is basically domesticating international standards, saying, oh yes, Canada will comply with all these, but who's the arbiter of that? Canada, the federal crown. So basically what they're doing is, we used to call it domesticating our rights, because they're making all our rights will be subject to federal control, federal approval, federal jurisdiction. It's not recognizing an order of jurisdiction on the part of First Nations. And that's why when you hear media reports or things talking about Land Management Act and the First Nations will get jurisdiction over lands, they're not getting jurisdiction. Their jurisdiction is not recognized. They're being delegated federal jurisdiction. They're just being allowed more options on how they might administer that federal jurisdiction. So that's important to understand. It's not jurisdiction. It's an
authority.
Yeah, it's under federal authority.
Yeah.
So we're not being recognized as an order of government, or, well, I guess Trudeau himself referred to this fourth level governments. So it's very problematic, and we're concerned, many of us are concerned that what it's doing is going to undermine the right to self-determination, because the federal government is the ultimate arbiter. And one other issue that's not getting attention is the fact that the Crown's sovereignty is in question. Because it's a simple assertion, the Crown asserted sovereignty over Canada, or what was known as the territory at the time, in 1764 under the British North America Act, or sorry, the Royal Proclamation. That's why it's part of our constitutional structure in Canada, is because that's where the Crown declared sovereignty over the territory. But on what basis, what legal basis? If Mabo in common law has established that discovery and terra nullius are not valid common law principles, then under what authority was that sovereignty applied? And I think this is a question that needs to be explored in depth, because it's questionable, this authority being applied, especially with regard to our people and our inherent rights. How did they acquire sovereignty over us? Now, I'm not suggesting that we want to be independent nations, but there are implications for anything in common law that's done. And what are the implications of this, and the legal basis of it? I think this needs to be explored further, because these colonial concepts, legal concepts, are not legal. They are not valid. They are not legitimate sources of authority. So basically, I mean, there was the colonial imposition of this sovereignty, and we never agreed to it in most cases. So where do we stand? And I think because of federal policy manipulating the situation, we're not getting these issues clarified. And in fact, these are with prejudice to the ultimate outcome of those questions. So that's why I think we need to be very careful in approaching these matters, not only when it comes to the Land Management Act, not only because it's not appropriate for most communities. I mean, West Bank, the ones that initiated this, it served their purposes because they're leasing, I think it's somewhere in the order of 2,500 lots. And I mean, they can finance their administration just off the revenue from that. But it's regulated though by the federal government under the act. This is the other thing that is bizarre. And the other trend that it's promoting is this incorporation and the use of corporations to replace our nations. You know, municipalities are corporate entities and have to raise funds. They even invest in the stock market to try to raise revenues. And that's what our communities will be forced into. I mean, I guess some of the economic development enthusiasts are looking forward to it. They think they're going to be like businessmen. Unfortunately, I think they're misguided because to me, what it's doing, it's ending that bilateral relationship with the Crown. I mean, it's still federal jurisdiction, but the thing is, we're cutting loose the obligations of the Crown. I don't know what that does to treaty obligations, but also we're still subject to provincial laws of general application. And I always say that is one of the key differences in Canada from the United States, where in the United States, in the 1940s, it was sort of an inadvertent event. They recognized the sovereignty of tribal nations, and they are not subject to state law. In Canada, it's very different. We have an Indian Act that applies across the board. They don't have that in the US. But further, what it does is that section providing for the application of provincial laws of general application, which means where it's not dealt with in the Indian Act or some other federal legislation, then provincial law will apply on Indian reserve lands. In the old days, you know, like my grandparents talked about, the days when you didn't need to have a license on the reserve to drive. But since that time, they've applied the Highway Traffic Act of the various provinces on the reserve. Right. But before, it wasn't the case. But that provision in the Indian Act is why we can't have casinos the way they do in the US. In the US, tribes have casinos based on their own tribal sovereignty, but it's regulated by Congress, of course, right? Because the sovereignty of Indian nations is recognized, tribal nations, but subject to the plenary powers of Congress, meaning the federal government can regulate the application of that sovereignty. In Canada, we have the provision that laws of general application will apply, which doesn't automatically mean that it should apply to, say, gaming, for instance, but because of certain court cases and the precedential nature of common law, it's being excluded from the heads of jurisdiction for First Nations. And keep in mind that everything the federal government does with respect to governance is guided by that, what they call the inherent right policy established in 1995 by Ron Irwin. That is the guiding principle, because it sets out in there the list of what they're prepared to negotiate with Indigenous peoples and what is not included. So that's very important. And Russ talks quite a bit about that list, because certain things are excluded, such as international relations and trade, which may not be appropriate, especially where our nations are split by the border. So there's so many interrelated issues, and that's the problem with our issues, because every issue is interrelated to something else, and it's difficult to explain to people, especially non-Indigenous people, you know, why, what, why we're in the situation we're in, and why we can't get out of it. So it's very difficult. But the First Nations Land Management Act is, I suppose, emblematic of the federal approach. And that was designed by bureaucrats long before the Liberals got in and the Conservatives. And it doesn't matter what government, it's the bureaucrats, the bureaucracy that is developing the policies and implementing them. And I find what they're doing now, because they never adequately financed the land management provisions of the Indian Act itself. Like surveys have always been a problem for bands and other requirements under that federal act. So they never adequately financed First Nations. Of course, we all know that, but the non-natives don't know that, this is what went on. And that we had our own trust accounts that repairs on reserves used to be financed out of our own trust funds, for building bridges, maintaining roads, and et cetera. And that our requests for expenditures were routinely rejected by the federal government. For instance, one of the most typical ones in the days when I was doing research at the archives was band councils passing resolutions requesting an allocation from their trust accounts so that they could purchase band instruments. Back in the old days, the early part of the last century, music was by bands, like brass bands and so forth. And many communities had bands like that, but they needed instruments, and the government would routinely turn them down for purchasing instruments. So it's a long history of colonial relations. And it seems to me what's going on is they're preserving, I think neocolonialism is a good thing to call it, because it's different. What they're doing is they're still controlling our governance, but they're doing it at the same time as they're releasing themselves from financial obligations. So I think they shouldn't be let go, because that is the incentive. As long as they're obligated under that fiduciary relationship, their very high standards should be applied, and they're not being high standards, especially with regard to specific claims. I mean, most bands have specific claims, have lost land somehow, or lost interests in, or lost funds from their trust accounts. They have to look at them and learn about them to see. But the thing is, these standards of the honor of the crown is always at stake, is what was said in Garing in dealing with land matters. And we're not finding a high standard of conduct being applied. In fact, I think it's deceptive and the opposite of what a fiduciary relationship is. So I'm not sure if in Canadian law defining the relationship as a fiduciary is really the appropriate mechanism, because they're not applying it. In fact, they're circumventing it, and they're duping our people into being the cooperative victims of their release from their colonial obligations, I guess you could call it. Because if you're cut loose, here's my point is that it's very dangerous. You're no longer, there's no longer federal financial obligations with respect to land, just say land, but they all converge at one point. But under that alternatives to the Indian Act, you're over 50% of the act is being eliminated, and you become a municipality. Basically, that's the model. And you're administering your lands like a municipality under that Torrance land management system. I think I forget what it's called. There's a name for that, how they manage lands into private lots and zoning and et cetera. That methodology, I mean, why can't we find alternatives to that recognize the collective nature of our cultures and land holdings? But in any case, you're dependent on raising your own revenue then. I mean, the federal government will, they're saying they will finance, I think it's 5 years provided for under the legislation. And they're saying they'll continue providing financial assistance, but it's no longer an obligation. And so the stress, the financial stress on community governance will be so great that taxation will have to be brought in, and user fees on everything. We're already seeing it in many bands that they're trying to charge fees on everything now. That's because the government is implementing this, whether you like it or not. My point about the land management, the lack of funding for it, that's what they're using now, just to channel people towards this Land Management Act. It's almost like you're being pushed into it. And it's a very dangerous precedent. And if we, okay, the thing is, they talk about becoming a part of the economy, the market economy, which is, based on a materialistic society, a consumer society, which some communities are not fully integrated into. And now you become a part of that, and you have to raise your revenues, your income within that framework. You're dependent on the general economy. And we don't know where that economy is headed, or, it has ups and downs. I mean, just look at the municipalities, our neighboring municipalities, and the struggles they have trying to govern and to maintain services, etc. It's a very different world than we're used to at this point. And of course, we've become dependent on the federal financing. So we have to find ways to transition. I think these alternative bills are like an instantaneous transition. There's no, let alone in choosing to pursue it, adequate information is not provided. Now, under the Act, the last point on my information sheet that I helped prepare there on the Land Management Act lists the issue, or lists the items that are to be provided to the community membership before they're asked to vote on this, adopting this act. And I find that the communities I'm seeing, certainly in my own community, that information was not provided. And we haven't voted on it. It's never come to a vote because community members were opposing it, and hopefully it's not over yet, but hopefully we've eliminated it, because you have to have that vote, but you need adequate information to have that vote. And the information is listed in the legislation. It says these are the material, and these are supposed to be provided to the membership. And it's not even being provided to the councillors in many cases. Councillors are going along with this stuff without understanding what they're doing. And in closing, I guess the last thing I should say, there's so much more I could say, but I don't want to take too much of your time. The last thing I would say in terms of legal issues is I'm really upset. I used to go to the annual meetings of the Indigenous Bar Association, but I think we've been done a disservice in regard to the Indian Act and these alternatives, because we're not getting proper legal advice. That Bill C-15 probably reflected it, because there was many legal counsel coming out in support of it. And I don't know what it is. And I'm disappointed with our Indigenous lawyers who have not been advising us as to what the situation is with respect to constitutional law, or with respect to sovereign relations between peoples and the right to self-determination. Do they not understand the right to self-determination? And how can they agree that Canada is implementing the right to self-determination? That's ridiculous. But they're not advising us so, and I've been trying to figure out why. Is it just that they're limited in knowledge. They're just used to dealing with the Crown framework and they can't think outside that box. Is that it? I don't know. I mean, I'm not a lawyer, but these are issues I think that that exist, and they're unwilling to question it. And sometimes I wonder, is it because of their oath to the Crown? Are they more loyal to the Crown than they are to finding solutions for our First Nations? Because they are not presenting us with all the implications, let alone looking at alternatives or possible courses of action. So I find that's a real deficiency going on, and I blame the Indigenous Bar Association. I'm going to try to articulate it and write them about the disappointment that we're not getting advised, that they can't seem to think out of the Crown box, and it's detrimental. I mean, our people, this is going to be a phase, I feel, that our grandchildren are going to look back on this period of history, the first 25 years of this century, and say that it was another period of ripoff and colonization. Because as we're saying, what they are doing is recolonizing our people, rather than recognizing that inherent right and developing a relationship based on the inherent right to jurisdiction. They are saying, oh no, that jurisdiction is under the federal Crown and we'll manage it with you. So I think many years from now, because once you accept these alternatives to the Indian Act, they're saying you're bound, there's no going back, according to them. And I think the damage it's going to do to our culture, to our jurisdiction, is just horrendous. And another generation is going to look back and say, what the heck happened here? How was this allowed to take place? So those are just some of the issues. I think I'm just skimming over a lot, but it's important to understand what the implications are of what our chiefs and councils are doing. And I think too, I don't know if it's a younger generation that didn't know the fights and struggles we went through opposing this kind of stuff, but they say there's over 100 bands now interested in the Land Management Act. They list it. I mean, my band's listed there, unfortunately, and that's how we found out about it. We didn't even know till somebody saw our name listed on the list, which is publicly available.
Relatives, check the list for your bands.
Yeah, because the chief and council can get you that far on to the list and get the funding to start developing the act, but the community consultation part is where we usually fall down anyway. But that seems to be not effective, because I think once people realize the implications of this, there'd be a little more discussion than's been taking place about it, because the implications are not being described. And that's my biggest disappointment with legal counsel, is that they're not articulating these issues properly.
Rolland, I have a question. Recently, Alberta Treaty 8 Nations, they're parting ways with the AFN. What do you think of the implications of that?
I don't. Well, this kind of stuff happened before. I mean, we had the PTNA back in the 80s, which was the Prairie Treaty Nations Alliance. They had a motto that said, nations make treaties, treaties do not make nations. But I found their membership proceeded as if the treaties created the nations. So it's important to think about what we're saying. But I'm no big, even though I spent 15 years with the AFN, I'm very disappointed in the direction it's gone. It was originally established as a advocate advocacy was its main role. It was set up in Ottawa so it could monitor the federal government's activities, and it could explain to First Nations the implications. It could gather from First Nations. It was a forum for First Nations nationally. I mean, when they changed the NIB in 1981 to AFN, giving each chief a vote rather than the provincial territorial organizations establishing that national leadership, there was many principles enunciated, and it seems to have been lost track of. I mean, one of the issues controversially has always been, not to get into that, a political organization should not be involved in program administration or program delivery. And it seems that's the way, the PTOs and the national organization are being steered by the federal government. And I know from being in there, it's a constant struggle to get financing. And I've seen it's like a roller coaster. When we had chiefs who were opposed, national chiefs that were concerned about our rights, the funding went right down. And then when we cooperate on their policy approaches and are willing to discuss those, then they pump up the financing. Like, I don't know how much they got when this last chief was in, but it was obviously, must have been pretty lucrative. I mean, that's after the Conservatives were pretty restrictive on their financing, and then the Liberals come in, and it seems like they're open arms to everything the Liberals are bringing in. And the words sound good, but like I'm trying to explain, they're not so good what they're doing. And in the 80s, there was that split from the, with the treaty nations. Then, and this reminds me of that, because I think I saw some comments that they were concerned about AFN getting into program management, federal programs. And, we're losing track of the original function, which is as an advocate and monitor on the federal government. And for financing, I think that's what undermines everything, is the federal financing, which began really after the white paper in '69, when the grassroots opposition rose up against, this government's arbitrary elimination of the Indian Act without dealing with land claims, without dealing with treaties. That stopped it at the time. But here we are 50 years later, and we're back to the same fundamental issue, although it's much more complicated now because we had 50 years of funding to fuzzify the issues. I mean, it was helpful. It did help allow us to educate ourselves. But the thing is, that financing has finally come home to roost, because they're using it and our dependence on it to manipulate us. And that's the case at the band level. That's the case at the political organization level, regionally and nationally. So anyone who stands up against federal policy now is framed as radical or somehow not representing the First Nations as a whole. And I think it's time that we need to talk to each other. That's for sure. If we isolate from each other, that's what facilitates the implementation of negative federal policies. So there needs to be communication and sharing of knowledge. But as far as accepting the administration of these federal programs and policies, it's very problematic, because the federal government has a plan. And believe me, it's not the politicians that are running that plan. It's the bureaucrats in the departments that they've created, 2 departments now, which is really, see, they take everything that we put forward, they will take it and turn it around and use it against us. Now, supposedly one department is for those who leave the Indian Act. Basically, accept governance under their new policies, their new approaches, where they don't have any financial obligation, and the bands remaining under the Indian Act are under this other department. So it really reflects that split.
Wow.
And I think a lot of bands that are falling into the other department and under a governance title are not fully aware of what they're doing. I think we need to be very careful about releasing federal obligations and of becoming dependent on our being, I shouldn't say dependent, being, well, yeah, dependent on the general economy, because that was not our agreement with the federal government, cutting us loose into this precarious economy, which could crash at any time. I mean, I know people have been saying that for years and it doesn't seem to happen, but I don't know what happens when it goes bad. And
right.
Our people shouldn't forget their traditional skills. I just know that. We need to maintain our spiritual beliefs, but also our land skills, because
right.
we might need them sooner than we think. And our young generation is not fully learning what they need to know to survive. And I'm concerned about that. And of course, I'm in Ottawa now. I was at home till just in September. I left. I came down here to try to seek some better medical solutions. But at home, it was getting so depressing. I mean, with the pandemic and the poverty and the despair, I mean, the suicide and the ODs, it's just unbelievable. It's not even newsworthy anymore. On my reserve, we have deaths happening every week practically.
Right. Same thing in Wikwemikong territory, my community across.
I'm finding out it's right across the country. There's a hidden, I think somebody should expose the statistics of what's happening, because I cannot believe how bad it is for the people.
Right.
And we have a chief and council who's saying they want to go into these federal initiatives because it's to help. They're only going to exasperate these issues. Like, for instance, the Land Management Act, you're setting it up. Basically, it's capitalizing the Indian lands. It's making your reserve the capital that the band has to invest and to raise its own revenue. But that ignores the fact, and then you remove the incentive to resolve the issues on Crown land. You know, whereas I think the reserve is our home, where we want to build our homes. We can't be mining it or, you know, stripping it, though some communities are. But we need, what about our interest in those Crown lands, our traditional territory? See, there's incentive to deal with that somewhat now because of the outstanding issues. But once you agree to these governance provisions, and you release the federal government of its financial obligation, where is the incentive for the Crown to address the outstanding issues? You're releasing all the leverage you have, in my view. And I feel very strongly about that, because I've seen through negotiations of all manner how this is prejudicial to our rights. And I put myself in the rights camp, that you know, we want our rights recognized properly, not manipulated as is taking place now. So I don't know. It's better if I answer questions, I think, to focus on what people have questions about.
Yeah, well, first, let me just say, for those who are just tuning in right now, I'm with Rolland Pangowish, and we've already been on the phone for 2.5 hours.
Oh my gosh.
It's pretty amazing. There are hundreds of questions, literally hundreds. And, this is important. We are going to take this and we are going to add it to our Decolonize Canada playlist. We've been doing these educational segments, and it's a joy to share space with you, Rolland. You are a wealth of knowledge and information. I'll just read off a couple of things maybe people have said. They're surrendering their power and rights for a check to play rich man with now. There's no comprehension at the level when they enter into those agreements. Let's see if I can backtrack a little bit. JC says, how are we going to overcome what's happening on our reserves when we have CNC that are bending to policies and not looking after what's happening in our reserves? A lot of questions, a lot of statements.
Mhm.
My band is fully in. We voted to no designations 3 times. How do we get entered into this secret meeting with CNC and voted on probably? Wow. So we've had quite a few people watching us consistently for the past 2.5 hours, Rolland. This has been shared out to our, I don't know, more groups all across Turtle Island. And I think maybe what we can do is we can do this again. I think, if we can find some time, and, we're just going to continue to add this to the series. It's important, I think, for people to understand these colonial mechanisms that keep our people impoverished. It's important to understand, what the underlying basis for Aboriginal title is, to understand, the doctrine of discovery, terra nullius, manifest destiny, and all these things that, continue to inform, racist policies, which only serve to subjugate and, really, I mean, these are termination. This is like the end game of termination policies, as I see it.
Yeah, that's good perspective. I hope I gave an overview. I know it's very general when I went over, but that's a framework within which everything can be discussed.
Yeah.
And I can address issues in more detail as questions are raised to me on particular areas, because within all this is a lot of different stuff, ranging from, band administration to international legal concepts. So it's quite a range of issues, but that's pretty well the knowledge our people need to have to survive in this legal world.
JC here says fiduciary duty to our people has been violated, and now we have grassroots people misinformed because we hear that same promise at election time. As the supposed beneficiaries, we are left in the dark when the policies are being created, because now at the band level, chief and council are the beneficiaries, not the band members. Mm-hmm. So, yeah. Okay, so there's a lot of comments. Thank you for sharing this window of 2.5 hours with us.
Yeah.
Doing more. You guys be sure to share this out to your groups, and remember, empower our young people to empower themselves. Walk with a kind heart, and thank you.
Thank
Many
you.
blessings, you guys. Hi.
Take care.